Welcome to the Uncommon Living podcast, where we host dialogues in human resilience. I'm Thomas Seager, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Sustainable Engineering at Arizona State University and the CEO of the Morosco Forge Ice Bath Company. Today's episode is a deep dive into the thermodynamics of life. This is something that I started 30 years ago when I was a doctoral student of engineering, and I read a book called What is Life by Erwin Schrödinger. And you're gonna hear in this podcast my solo lecture explaining the three different eras or applications of entropy as heat transfer, mass transfer, and information transfer. If you're ready for a graduate lecture from an engineer on how thermodynamics relates to health, this is the podcast for you. 1945, an Austrian physicist named Erwin Schrödinger wrote a book called What is Life? Schrödinger is best known for an equation that bears his name. The Schrödinger equation is an expression, a mathematical model of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics was a paradigm shift in physics. Physics was founded first on Newtonian mechanics. Isaac Newton, to correctly predict, to model the movement of the planets around the sun, he invented Newtonian mechanics. And to do it, he needed calculus. Calculus didn't exist at the time. Newton and a German mathematician, Leibniz, were both working on calculus. The central problem of calculus is always reducible to the same thing: infinity times zero. And it depends upon this assumption that the number line is infinitely divisible, that no matter which two numbers you pick, 1, 2, 1.5, 1 3/4, that there are an infinite amount of numbers between any two numbers on the number line. Calculus, the problem of infinity times zero, depends upon the concept of the differential, that there is an infinitely divisible number line, and that the numbers do not change their properties at any scale. So Newton is incredibly successful using calculus to invent mechanics and predict the movement of the planets around the sun. The problem that emerged in the 20th century is that life, biology, is not infinitely divisible. Physics, the physical materials of the universe, and even energy, not infinitely divisible. When you leave the scale of the galaxy and you reduce to the scale of biology, where individual molecules become important, Newtonian physics breaks down. This is because there are no in-between states. That is, electrons are a good example. Electrons exist in certain shells, and they're either in one shell or another shell. There is no in-between shell. You cannot infinitely divide up a molecule and expect that the molecule will retain the same properties of that molecule. You cannot divide up an atom to infinity and expect that the atom will retain the same properties. So Newtonian mechanics does not describe chemistry, and chemistry is the underlying physical science of biology. To do mathematics at that scale that is relevant to the cell, to the biological molecule, you need quantum mechanics. And Schrödinger was best known for developing the Schrödinger equation. Now, the Schrödinger equation is complex, and it's kind of a litmus test in physics and mathematics of the mathematical acumen of the scientist. I can't solve it. I can't use it. I'm an engineer, not a pure mathematician or a physicist, and my mathematical skills don't reach to the level of being able to work with the Schrödinger equation. I can appreciate it without being able to solve it. Nonetheless, Schrödinger's interests were much more broad than just his equation. And he wrote this book in 1945 called What is Life? Schrödinger was Austrian, and you can imagine the state of the world at the end of 1945. World War II in Europe was wrapping up, and Schrödinger was one of the witnesses to the great genocide that accompanied the Nazi Reich. Schrödinger must have known about many of his Jewish colleagues in physics who either fled the Nazis to reach safer quarters in the United States or in Sweden, or perished at the hands of the Nazis. And perhaps it makes sense that he was wondering, what is life at a time when it is being extinguished? But as a physicist, of course, Schrödinger saw it through the lens of thermodynamics. Life is the structured flow of something he called negentropy, negative entropy. Schrödinger was faced with a semantic problem. The word energy is ambiguous. It's poetic. It means so many different things. You could get up in the morning and say, I don't really have a lot of energy today. Or you could look at your electric bill and say, how much energy did we use last month? Energy has a first law of thermodynamics description. Energy is that thing that cannot be created or destroyed. That's the conservation law, the first law. But it also has a second law definition, which means the capacity to perform thermodynamic work. And this confusion of having the same word for so many different things was a problem in explaining physical or thermodynamic processes. So Schrödinger latched onto this word negentropy, negative entropy. And it's important to understand what entropy is if you're going to understand negentropy. Entropy is a made up thing. It's not like temperature or volume or mass. Entropy is a made up concept that we use to try and help solve problems in engineering. Entropy was a new word invented by a German physicist, Clausius. Clausius wanted to be able to describe why and how hot bodies cool off. They never warm up, they only cool off. He invented this concept called entropy that we cannot see, we cannot measure. There's no such thing as like an entropy meter, like there is a thermometer. You cannot observe entropy directly. And entropy is not the property of a thermodynamic system. Entropy can only be measured as the difference between two states of a thermodynamic system. You need a reference state and whatever the new state is. So the best way to think of entropy is it's a made up word for a made up concept that helps us solve problems in physics and engineering. When I was doing my doctoral studies in environmental engineering, I was very concerned with applications of thermodynamics in the environment. And I discovered that there were something like 27 different formal definitions of entropy in the scientific literature. At first, I was distraught. I didn't understand what entropy was, and I thought I would never finish my doctoral dissertation if I didn't figure it out. And that's when I realized that entropy has actually come to mean multiple things. When Clausius defined it, he was trying to solve certain problems of heat transfer. And so he defined it as the change in entropy is equal to the heat flow or the heat transferred divided by the temperature. Of course, when a hot body cools, temperature goes down over time. And because temperature is in the denominator of this fraction, heat transfer over temperature, entropy must always increase. And this helped Clausius and other engineers and physicists solve problems in thermodynamics related to the steam engine. Remember that the steam engine was marking the initial stages of the Industrial Revolution. In the United Kingdom, they reached a point where Pretty much all the trees had been cut. Population was expanding, and they turned to coal as a primary source of energy. Coal gets dug out of the ground. And so, I don't know, you got to hire some children or something to go down into the mine and chip out the coal from the ground and bring it up to the surface where it can be sold. Of course, the deeper you go, the more work it takes to lift the coal up. And eventually you hit water. That water has to be pumped out of the mine. And it used to be that the first coal mines in the United Kingdom, providing this primary source of energy to replace wood, they were dewatered by pumps using horses as the source of power. So the horses would, they would walk around in a circle, they would operate the pumps. Now, what better invention could there be than the steam engine? The steam engine would use coal to operate the pumps to dewater the mine and allow the mine owner to extract more coal. The steam engine was essentially invented by James Watt. And in order to sell it to coal mining companies, James Watt needed to demonstrate it and explain the utility of the machine. He invented a term called horsepower, because the first question that the coal mining owners would ask is, well, how many horses of work can this engine of yours do? And they're thinking like businessmen do, if I don't have to feed the horses oats, I'm going to save that money. I can feed the machine this coal instead, and the machine will perform the work. How many horses am I allowed to get rid of? How much am I going to save in oats when I buy your machine? So Watt created this unit of measure called horsepower, which of course we still use today to describe the capacity of machines, to like an automobile engine, to perform thermodynamic work. And he underestimated it. He wanted to under promise and over deliver like a good businessman would. And so he said, well, this machine will do the work of 3 horses. It will do the work of 4 horses. And then the coal miners were delighted to find out that they could actually replace 5 or 6. This is the way the horsepower unit of measure was defined, because the problem at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was a problem of heat transfer. That is the way that steam engines work. And Clausius invented this word entropy to help engineers and physicists solve problems in heat transfer. It was a French engineer, Sadi Carnot, who is credited with the discovery of the second law of thermodynamics. And one of the things that's so confusing about thermodynamics is its history. The second law was discovered before the first law, and after they had those two, they realized they needed another law, but they couldn't fit it in, so they called it the zeroth law of thermodynamics because that felt more primary. That zeroth law is that 2 bodies brought into thermal equilibrium will reach that thermal equilibrium by transferring heat from the warmer body or the hotter body to the cooler one. And this is a fundamental postulate of thermodynamics on which everything else depends, and it's now called the zeroth law. But Carnot was credited with the second law because he's the one who wrote out an equation describing the maximum efficiency of the ideal steam engine. And it's not 100%. It is proportional to the temperatures. The maximum efficiency of the ideal steam engine relates to the temperature at which it wastes heat or pushes heat out into the environment, and the temperature at which work can be extracted. So the high temperature would be inside the combustion chamber, and then the low temperature would be the exhaust. The exhaust temperature can never be colder than the environment. And so the maximum possible efficiency would be an engine that has a high temperature in its combustion chamber and a low temperature in its exhaust. Carnot figured this out, and people said, aha, that's entropy. That's the second law. Entropy is always increasing. There will always be waste, even in what we call an ideal system. These problems of heat transfer resulted in the invention of the steam engine. It was modified from Watt's, of course, original invention, and it was put on wheels that could travel on rails. And we came up with the steam locomotive. In the United States, at first, where wood was abundant, they ran these locomotives off of firewood. But coal is a more energy dense resource. It will burn hotter. Remember that the maximum efficiency improves as the temperature in the combustion chamber improves. If you can get coal to burn hotter than wood, then you can increase the efficiency of your steam locomotive or your steam boat. And you can improve the economy of the engine and make more money by reducing your fuel costs. An engineer was that person, that professional who could design the steam engine for higher temperatures and greater efficiency without the thing blowing up. My first faculty job was in engineering at Purdue University. And you probably remember that the nickname for the Purdue sports team is the Boilermakers. Purdue is known for the quality of its engineering programs. The Boilermakers were the people who built those combustion chambers or built the boilers attached to those combustion chambers that would boil the steam and then power the steam locomotive. The higher the temperature and the higher the pressure inside that boiler, the more efficient the locomotive and the lower the fuel costs. The very first technical regulation in the United States regulated the design and construction of boilers for steam engines because economic pressures were causing the engineers to experiment with higher temperatures and higher pressures. And eventually, they experimented too far. Some operator would run it too hot at too high a pressure, and the thing would blow up, resulting in injuries and death to the customers on the steamboat. We can't have that. The government stepped in to try and solve the problem where all of the steam engine designers and manufacturers are pushing higher temperatures and higher pressures because they're in competition with one another. And they said, this is the new regulation. You may not operate your boiler except under these conditions, which we will say are legal. And to solve this problem of competition, they cannot compete by sacrificing safety. And that initiated a long line of safety and consumer protection regulations on innovators in technology in America. So you can see the problems of heat transfer related to the Industrial Revolution, to economic growth, to technological innovation, and to everything that was happening in the 19th century. But entropy wasn't done. The next state of problems were those of mass transfer. You might not be aware, but at the time of the steam engine, the lamps weren't being lit by coal or even coal gas. They were lit by whale oil. Whale oil burns clean and odorless. There was no such thing as electric light when the steam engine was invented. Lighting was provided by whale oil or some other combustion process. And of course, we ran out of whales, but that was okay. Colonel Drake figured out how to drill a well in Western Pennsylvania, and out of that well came oil. When you refine the oil into its different fractions of lighter and heavier hydrocarbons, you can extract from that petroleum kerosene. And kerosene is a better fuel for lamps than whale oils because you don't have to scour the Pacific Ocean looking for the whales to get it. The problem with oil refining is a problem of mass transfer, not just heat transfer, but also material transfer. Entropy had to be reformulated to solve problems in mass transfer. And there were two people who were essential to this. One of them was Ludwig Boltzmann. Boltzmann was another Austrian physicist. And Boltzmann realized that entropy of heat transfer could be expressed as entropy of mass transfer, that it was a matter of movement of the molecules. And he did some sophisticated mathematics and some thought experiments to prove that entropy of heat transfer could be expressed as entropy of mass transfer, that these were the same things. But it was an engineer in the United States. His name was Josiah Willard Gibbs. He graduated from Yale University. He was the first person in the US to earn a doctorate of engineering. Of course, after he graduated, he couldn't find a job, so he stayed on at Yale. And he invented something called the chemical potential. Gibbs and what is now known as Gibbs free energy is essential to solving problems in chemical engineering. And so now the problem of mass transfer is not just one of refining petroleum, but also making things, new things out of hydrocarbons, using petroleum as a material feedstock rather than just an energy feedstock. So at this point, we have steam engines, we have assembly lines, we have an understanding of entropy as heat transfer, we have an understanding of entropy as mass transfer, and problems are being solved, for example, by J.D. Rockefeller, who founded the Standard Oil Company and sought to monopolize refining capacity throughout the United States. When Ford's first vehicles became commercially successful, they could run on anything: ethanol, kerosene, which is essentially diesel fuel, or gasoline. And Rockefeller said, "Hey, Ford, this gasoline stuff, it's lighter than the kerosene, and I don't really have a market for it. Would you make cars that run on gasoline so I can sell this gasoline as this byproduct of kerosene refining?" And Ford did. This is why we have gasoline powered cars in the United States, because gasoline, that lighter fraction, wasn't being used for lighting lamps like kerosene was. Gasoline is used in cars, and now the refineries aren't optimized for producing kerosene, they're optimized for producing gasoline. We need the entropy of mass transfer and Gibbs' concept of the chemical potential to create the technologies that divide petroleum into all of its different fractions and create the feedstocks for plastics and everything else in our material economy that is sourced from hydrocarbons. And entropy still wasn't done. It was after World War II. And remember, the steam engine has become, if not entirely obsolete, it has become overshadowed by the diesel engine, which is running locomotives and running large vessels, and the gasoline engine, which is running light vehicles or automobiles. There was a master's student at MIT who was familiar with Boltzmann's work in entropy as mass transfer. And he was working on computing. His master's thesis described how to make the circuits that represented logical operators, like an AND function or an if function, so that you could do logical mathematical operations with electronics rather than doing them on a chalkboard. His name was Claude Shannon. And his master's thesis was one of the most influential, no, it was the most influential master's thesis in the history of higher education. Shannon gave us the mathematical basis to translate these logical questions into electronic circuits. You're probably anticipating that this is critical to computers. There was another mathematician and computer scientist. He was in the United Kingdom. His name was Alan Turing. During World War II, he worked on breaking the Nazi codes. The codes were transmitted over radio frequencies. So these secret messages would be encoded, transmitted, and then the Nazis would be able to decode them. And this is how they communicated so they could allocate resources, during the war. The British figured out how to crack that code. It was thought to be unbreakable, but Turing built a computer to crack it. So now the British spies had good information on what the Nazis were communicating and planning and how they were responding. And this was essential to winning the war. You can probably understand how after World War II, Alan Turing was a critical member of the British concept of defense. The only problem was Alan Turing was homosexual. And at the time, homosexuality in the United Kingdom was illegal. And so, as badly as the kingdom needed Turing and his expertise on messaging and encoding and computing, they couldn't get over this like moral legal blockade over his homosexuality, which he had to suppress, which he had to hide from the world. And eventually, when it was brought to light, the British gave him a choice: chemical castration, that is, drugs to suppress his libido, or prison. He started taking the drugs, if I remember his story correctly, and he got so depressed about it that he eventually killed himself. The irony is, so did Ludwig Boltzmann. By the time Boltzmann ended his own life, his ideas had already been accepted. He'd already been honored as a pioneer in the field of physics. Initially, his ideas met with a lot of resistance and he was ridiculed by his colleagues. But by the time he was so depressed that he committed suicide, he'd already been acknowledged. The history of thermodynamics is sort of littered with these tragic figures who were at first not to be believed, but later were revealed to be geniuses. And all of the emotional struggles that they dealt with along the way makes for good reading if you're interested. But our concern right now is about the third use of entropy. And this is for describing information transfer. Shannon, he was an interesting guy. He shared Turing's interest in decoding, in compressing information. It was partly because he was hired by Bell Labs in New Jersey. And Bell Labs at that time wanted to be able to compress information to make it cheaper to send across the country. If you're going to do a long distance phone call, you're going to send a telegram. What's the minimum amount of data to which that message could be compressed and then sent across the country and then expanded again and delivered? So Shannon was asked to work on this. Shannon had a fascination with crossword puzzles, with gambling, not because he wanted to make money, but because to him, blackjack was an interesting problem. He made a computer and he brought it out to Las Vegas and he devised a wireless communication network between the hotel room in which he set up the computer and him at the blackjack table so he could program the computer using touch pads in his shoe, counting cards before counting cards was even a thing, had the computer do the computations. And just to prove his point, he went to the blackjack table and won money. Then he shut it down, packed the whole thing up, went back to New Jersey. That's the kind of guy Claude Shannon was. He recognized that the minimum data packets, so we could say the information contained in this communication, it was an expression that he could mathematically model using Boltzmann's information model of entropy. Shannon invented the entropy of information, which is mathematically the same as the entropy of mass transfer, which is again mathematically equivalent to heat transfer. Shannon, Turing, and other computer scientists gave us that is the entropy of information transfer. Now, I'm going to remind you that this whole podcast lecture started with Schrödinger's "What is Life?" and Schrödinger's idea that life is the structured flow of negative entropy, or that energy which is capable of performing thermodynamic work. Another word for it is exergy. And to understand negative entropy, or exergy, we must understand entropy. There are three different types of problems that this made-up concept of entropy helps us solve. Heat transfer, that's the steam engine. Mass transfer, that's plastics and the chemical refinery. And information transfer, that's the computer. I'm going to go back to Turing. Turing invented something called the Turing test. And he brought it out at parties as a game. He would put, let's say, there would be a woman at the party on one side of the door. Maybe she's in the bedroom, and the rest of the partygoers would be on the other side, and they would pass notes underneath the door. And so they would have to, ask questions to see if they could determine the sex of the person answering. This is an amusing game, and Turing was no doubt a delight at parties. In modern instantiations of this game, sometimes the questions are like, what does the transmission in an automobile do? And then you have to guess, what would a man say? What would a woman say? And we know that there are gender stereotypical perspectives, gender stereotypical bodies of knowledge that might inform our guess. That's the Turing game. When you realize that Turing was homosexual and that he had to hide his homosexuality by law or suffer these punitive consequences, maybe you could sympathize with a man who invents a game about testing people's capacity to hide their sexuality. There must have been something about Turing's life and the circumstances in which he worked that invented this game. But the Turing test, as he applied it to computers, has had much longer lasting power. The Turing test is, if you ask a computer program a question, could you tell whether the answer from the computer was written by a program or by a human being? And Turing suggested that when a computer can answer questions in plain language that are indistinguishable from human answers, that's when we would consider computers to be intelligent. It was ChatGPT 3, if I'm remembering correctly, that first passed the Turing test. We have gone through the age of entropy for heat transfer. We have gone through the age of entropy for mass transfer, and these technologies are still important to us. We are now in the age of entropy of information transfer because computers have passed the Turing test. These large language models, these artificial intelligence agents, they dialogue with us human beings in ways that cause us to confuse. We think they have an identity. We give them names like Alexis, and we interact with them as if they were human because they've passed the Turing test. The question is, as posed by Schrödinger, what is life? And Schrödinger says it is this organized flow of negative entropy, of the capacity to do work, not disorganized, not like the way that a hot, bottle of water would cool off. This is disorganized production of entropy, disorganized flow of exergy. Schrödinger is saying that when you take that thermodynamic flow of the capacity to do work and you organize it, that is life. How is this organized? Your body is a combination, just like all living systems at any scale, of heat transfer, mass transfer, and information transfer. The order in which they were discovered or conceptualized in engineering and physics is the opposite of their order of importance. I mean, it makes sense that the simplest was discovered first. That's heat transfer. Material transfer, more difficult to understand, more difficult to apply, more difficult to study. And information discovered last because it's the most complex and difficult of them all. But the order of importance in your body is information transfer, then material transfer, and then mass transfer. Here's the irony. When it comes to our understanding of body composition, of weight, and of diet, many people elevate the simplest model to the top, the calories in, calories out model. And they say, well, you want to lose weight? That's a simple equation. It's just thermodynamics. They don't know the first thing about thermodynamics. But because they're using this word, this French word calorie, that was adopted from thermodynamics, that was used by the Carnot engineers optimizing the steam engine. They spoke in terms of calories. And then they took that term and exapted it and applied it to nutrition in the most rudimentary and oversimplified way. And now it's on all the food labels, and all the dietitians are saying, oh, to stay healthy, you have to limit your calories. And it doesn't really matter where the calories come from. What a crock a crap that is. You can feed a steam engine on wood. You can feed a steam engine on coal. You could feed a steam engine on diamonds or sugar cane if you wanted to. If you are a steam locomotive, a calorie is sort of a calorie. They burn at different temperatures, and the quality of the calorie is important to the steam engine because the more energy is packed into the smaller volume, the more calories in that mass, the higher the temperature of the steam engine and the more efficient. But you can't run a human body on coal. You can't eat diamonds and expect to live because you can't digest these things. The idea of the calories in, calories out is such a radical oversimplification. It reduces the thermodynamics, it reduces life, the thermodynamics of the body, to the equivalent of a steam engine, which is a damaging, oversimplified metaphor. You are not a steam locomotive. What's most important to your health and well-being is not the entropy of heat transfer. It is the entropy of information transfer. Now, Schrödinger's book predated the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA. Watson and Crick come along later and they say, oh, look, DNA, it's organized in a double helix. And part of the industrial ethos at the time projected onto DNA this idea that it was the blueprint of the body or the master controller of the body. No, it's not. The DNA is essentially inert. It does contain information. It will encode RNA, which then results in proteins. And those proteins are information. Information that runs the entire body. They are information most importantly. But what controls the expression of your genome? The epigenome. The epigenome is a layer around the DNA that turns genes on and off. What controls the epigenome? The mitochondria. And there's a good reason for it. The mitochondria are the sensory organelles. The mitochondria, that's what sense your light environment, for example. The mitochondria are sensitive to the different wavelengths of light that your body is exposed to. They respond to that light. They know when it's dark. They know when it's bright. They know when you're in the forest. They know when you're at the beach. And it is the mitochondrial activity that is dynamic and responsive to the environment. It's not the DNA. The mitochondria are in constant communication with the DNA. And it is the mitochondria that rearrange, that recode the epigenome in response to the environmental signals that they receive. It's also the mitochondria that respond to your food. When you eat food, it must be digested first in your gut by your gut microbiome. The organisms that are responsible for your digestion, they don't even belong to you. They have their own DNA. These are the microbiome in your gut lining. These are separate creatures from you. They have their own needs, and they live in a symbiotic relationship with the rest of your body, but they have their own agenda. They will send signals to your brain, cravings that make you want to eat the food that they need. If you're on a high carbohydrate diet and you want to switch over to ketosis and you don't have metabolic flexibility, your gut microbiome is going to fight you on that. It's going to say, no, we need more carbohydrates to fuel our agenda, our replication, our proliferation. And they will send signals to your brain that cause you to crave more carbohydrates. And so your gut microbiome does the job of digesting your food and putting into your bloodstream those metabolites that your mitochondria are going to use. It's your mitochondria that sense the fatty acid profile, that sense the glucose levels in your bloodstream. And it's your mitochondria that are called upon to adapt accordingly. Your DNA doesn't have that adaptive capacity. The mitochondria are dynamic, the DNA static. So your mitochondria are responding to your light environment, your diet, and your thermal environment. When you get cold. It is the mitochondria in your brown fat that produce the heat that keeps your body warm. These three elements of your environment, light, food, and temperature, are signals, are information for your mitochondria. And it's your mitochondria's job to adapt the body to the circumstances that it is being exposed to. It is your mitochondria that are the information pathways that govern all of the rest of the processes in the body. And how do they do that? By interacting certainly with the nervous system. This is a two-way level of communication. For example, brown fat is highly innervated. It has a lot of nerves running through it, so it can respond rapidly to signals from the hypothalamus. But the mitochondria also create these signals by producing hormones. Hormones are like condensed information. They're an arrangement of molecules that tell other processes in the body what to do. As an example, all of the sex hormones originate in the mitochondria. In the inner membrane of the mitochondria, cholesterol is converted to a sex steroid called pregnenolone. It is that pregnenolone then that is further metabolized into all the other sex hormones, whether that's estradiol or testosterone. Think about the effects of those hormones on your muscle or your body composition or your sex function. Those hormones are material embodiments of information that signal what the rest of the processes of your body should do. And this is why the calories in, calories out model of health is so oversimplified that we should just discard it as wrong. It's not the heat transfer of the body that is most important. It is, what does your body do with that flow of exergy? How does your body allocate the exergetic or the negentropy resource? How does it structure that flow of the thermodynamic capacity to do work? Does it store that capacity in the white fat cells? Does it build new muscle, which takes a lot of, second law energy, a lot of exergy, or a lot of negentropy flow? Does it power thoughts in your brain? Your brain uses like 25% of your total metabolic throughput. What does your body do with the calories that you're eating is far more important than the quantity of calories that you're eating. There are four hormones in particular that are worth paying attention to. Two of them control your appetite, ghrelin and leptin. They give you the cravings of how much to eat and when to eat. And this is sort of a psychological expression of these hormones. There's a really fascinating study called the milkshake study, two identical drinks. And they gave one of the experimental groups the same milkshake, and they said, this is a dessert drink. They reported in that group, the ones who drank it as a dessert drink, feeling very full, their appetite had been sated, and they didn't want to eat anymore. They gave the same exact milkshake to another experimental group, and they said, this is a diet drink. It tastes rich and delicious, but it's very low calorie. And that group reported still being hungry and craving more. These hormones don't just respond to your physiology. They respond to your psychology. They respond to the story you're telling yourself about the food that you eat or the experience that you had. And as part of this milkshake study, they measured ghrelin. And the ghrelin levels in the body, remember, that is a material condensation of information. In this case, it's a material representation of the story people were told about the milkshake. The ghrelin levels in the experimental group that said they were eating a diet milkshake were consistent with increased appetite, just as that experimental group reported. Leptin and ghrelin are two hormones that control your cravings for more food. So they are important in regulating your appetite. But two hormones in regulating your body composition are insulin and myostatin. Insulin regulates fat growth. It is an information signal that says, get this energy into our fat cells. Myostatin regulates muscle growth. And so if your goal is to gain muscle and to lose fat, you must control the insulin and the myostatin levels in such a way that the energy coming in is allocated to muscle growth or wound healing or hair growth or growth of your skeleton if you're young or whatever it is, and not to growth of fat cells. Hormones are information agents that control the heat and material transfer. Information first, material second, heat transfer last. So there's a hierarchy of importance, and is in the reverse order that it was discovered in physics and engineering and thermodynamics, but in the order of its complexity and difficulty to understand. When you learn to think of food first as an information signal, light first as an information signal, temperature first as an information signal, and then as a mass transfer or as material building blocks for the body, and only then as heat transfer, as exergy sources for the body. Now you have the hierarchy in the right order. It's not that calories don't matter at all. It's that they matter less than the composition of the food. Calories, the caloric value of the food, matters less than the material composition of the food. You know how they measure calories? They put it in something called a bomb calorimeter, which is a lot like the combustion chamber of a steam engine. They incinerate the food. They try and estimate the non-digestible quantities. They measure the heat given off in the calorimeter, subtract whatever they think is non-digestible, and then that's the food calorie content. So if you put, diamonds into the bomb calorimeter, you wouldn't get very much different value than you would if you got charcoal or coal. And then you'd have to say, well, how much of the diamonds or the coal can the human body digest? And you say, well, none. And so it doesn't have a food caloric value. But when you put in something like whole wheat, some of that is undigestible fiber. And you have to estimate and subtract out. The calorie calculations are actually very crude, because the amount of the energy content that you can absorb, that you can metabolize in your body, is based essentially on educated guesswork. The bomb calorimeter that determines the food calorie content is a steam engine technology. It is nowhere near sophisticated enough. It's very convenient if you happen to sell seed oils, if you happen to make a living out of selling corn syrup or processed sugar. It's very convenient to convince people that the most important thing about their food is the caloric value. And that's why when you look at the nutrition label, the calories are the biggest thing on the nutrition label, and the ingredients are typed out in this tiny little font so that you have to work to find out how much monosodium glutamate is in your food. Calories are the least important of the three. Information. Blueberries in Phoenix, Arizona in January are telling my body the wrong thing, because it's not blueberry season. Just like in the wintertime, I'm meant to be cold. In the wintertime, I'm meant to get less light. In the wintertime, I'm meant to eat fish, stored foods, maybe sweet potatoes, because I'm recording this on the day before Thanksgiving, maybe pumpkins, maybe those crops that are harvested late in the fall are seasonally appropriate. Those things like strawberries are discordant with the season. They send my body the wrong information. Food is information first, material second, and energy third. This is how to sustain life. This is how to speak about thermodynamics. The hormones are those material embodiment of energy that are produced by the computing. I'm going to use this metaphor, even though I'm hesitant, the computing agents of your body, which are the mitochondria, not the DNA. It is the mitochondria that signal all the other actions that your body must be taking to adapt to your environment and stay healthy. It's the mitochondria that run the AI algorithms inside your body. To heal, we need a model of medicine that is predicated on the mitochondria, not on the genome, not on the chemical pill, but on the information signaling that cause the mitochondria to do the things inside our body that will keep us healthy. What the Industrial Revolution stole from us is the realization that we have the capacity to heal ourselves. Our institutions of medicine have convinced us that we need factories to stay alive. But it's the factories that are keeping us sick in the first place. With rare exceptions like type 1 diabetes, I'm glad that we have genetically modified E. coli bacteria that are producing human insulin that will keep my son with type 1 diabetes alive. But how did he get type 1 diabetes? Because type 1 diabetes originates in a deficiency of vitamin D in the first year of life. And why was he vitamin D deficient? Because his mother and he didn't have enough sunshine. He didn't get enough cold exposure to produce light in the mitochondria inside his brown fat cells that would then convert cholesterol into pre-vitamin D and maintain the essential levels when his immune system is developing as a baby. It is the disconnection from the environment brought by the Industrial Revolution that is making us sick. And it is the institutionalized, centralized, allopathic medicine, which is its own type of factory that has convinced us to fix the ills of the factory. We need this other factory over here. And I disagree. There's a role for machines in our life. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, the hottest city in North America. I'm not going to get cold exposure unless I get into my Morosco ice bath. I have built a machine that will do for me what I no longer get from nature. This is why we call Morosco the next best thing to nature. It would be much better for me to dig a hole or in the ice and jump into the lake and do my ice fishing in the winter. I don't live under those circumstances. I love my job at Arizona State University. I live here because this has been good to me, but I must compensate for the deficiencies of my urban desert environment with machines. Most people in Phoenix are vitamin D deficient, and it's not for a lack of sunshine. It's because they don't go outside in the summertime. If it's 115 degrees Fahrenheit on the sidewalk, people, they practically sprint to the car that they've parked in the shade because they want to get to that air conditioned car environment. They don't allow themselves sunshine in the wintertime in Phoenix. It's too damn hot. They stay indoors. And as a consequence, they're vitamin D efficient. They're not just vitamin D efficient, they're also infrared light deficient because indoors you are disconnected from the infrared portion of the solar spectrum, as well as being disconnected from the UV portion of the solar spectrum. And our fluorescent lights are not sending us the right information signals through our mitochondria to create those other chemical signals inside our body that keep us healthy. There's a role for machines. It might be your infrared panel, it might be your sauna, it might be your ice bath, it might be your migraine lamp that reproduces the green wavelengths of the shady forest that your body is physiologically tuned to. I'm an engineer. I'm not a medical doctor. I build machines. And I build the machines that are intended to signal you with the information you need to stay healthy. That's why I've started this podcast, the Uncommon Living podcast. We have these AI agents, and they seem very convincing. There are people on Twitter who will fact check me with Grok as if that made any difference. Look, from an AI agent, you are going to get the average of all the Reddit sources on which they were trained. When you query Grok or Perplexity or Claude or Chat or Gemini, you're going to get the average of all the data sources on which they were trained. The results are going to leave you with an average state of health. That's not good enough for me. I don't want to be average because I'm 59 years old and it's very common for men my age to be on 5 different prescription pills. Here's your statins for your cholesterol. No. They won't extend your life at all. And they have a whole bunch of series of side effects, including dementia, but you should have them to get your LDL labs down. What a crock of hooey that is. Oh, wait, your blood pressure is a little high. Here, we're going to give you another pill to try and bring your blood pressure down. You're so disconnected from the environment. You live inside the factory. We need the products of this other factory to try and make the conditions under which you live more tolerable and, by the way, more profitable for pharmaceutical companies. I don't want that. I don't want average. Because these AI agents in our age of entropy as information transfer are trained on the public sources like Reddit, you are going to get from them the collective wisdom, such as it is, of Reddit. And that's not good enough for me. I'm here to live an uncommon life. I'm here to live a life without prescription medicines. I'm here to share my total testosterone levels above 1,000 nanograms per deciliter with the world. And what I did to reach that state of health, I'm going to control my information environment. And so what does that mean? What do I eat? Food is information. What are the materials that I bring into my body that signal the processes within my body? What's my light environment like? I'm not worried about blue light during the day. There's the blue sky, there's the blue water. Blue during the day is fine. I can even take a lot of non-native EMF abuse, whether that's Wi-Fi or the cell phone towers during the day. But at night, my mitochondria have been working so hard to adapt to this extraordinary environment during the day. They need a rest. I need my sleep. The mitochondria need to recover. All of my testosterone is made at night. And so all of the stressors during the day could be hormetic for me as long as I have a period of recovery. Food falls into that category. Light falls into that category. Temperature falls into that category. And that's why I founded an ice bath company so that you can signal your body and care for your mitochondria and stimulate inside you the adaptive, dynamic changes that are going to keep you healthy, that are going to correct your hormone profile, that are going to do for you what used to happen in the ordinary course of life for our ancestors, and we have now become disconnected from. Thanks for tuning in to Uncommon Living.